Hello, everybody. This is Jeffrey Williams with Too Late for the Gods. And I'd like to welcome tonight's guest, Caleb, the Dry Apologist. Thank you for appearing, Caleb. I've really been looking forward to this discussion. This is the fifth in this series of just simply exploratory discussion from philosophical perspectives. The ones in the past have been, I think, very, very good. And I fully expect this one will be just as good, or even better. The way that we approach these is, I look back to what Wittgenstein said when he denounced the Tractatus and analytic philosophy and propositional logic. He denounced those because he saw them still mired in metaphysics, and the metaphysical language caused a lot of knots and illusions. And he said philosophy should be therapeutic going forward. It's dialogue in nature, looking at what's there and dispelling the illusions from the elusive philosophical language of the last 2,500 years to remove what's not there. And it's in that spirit that we've been having these conversations. Tonight, we're going to look at metaphysics as we have in the past. Is there ground for it? Need we take it seriously? Or as Wittgenstein said, is it nonsense? Is it sinnlos? As some of you know, I come from the continental tradition. I hold with those who say that the two most brilliant thinkers of the 20th century were Heidegger and Wittgenstein. I very much believe that. There's some overlap there. They both pronounced philosophy dead. They both asserted the importance of overcoming metaphysics, and they gave up their previous philosophical positions, Heidegger with phenomenology, Wittgenstein with analytic philosophy, and moved on to instead a focus on language. And that's where they parted ways. They saw language mostly, essentially differently, but they both had tremendous contributions. So tonight we're going to discuss from a 21st century perspective, and being post Heidegger, post Wittgenstein, does metaphysics hold up? Need we take metaphysical arguments in philosophy seriously? Dry Apologist was kind enough to volunteer to come on and be part of this discussion. Caleb, would you like to introduce yourself or say anything?
Yeah, sure. I have a channel called Dry Apologist where I host discussions and post some short videos from time to time. And yeah, I just enjoy debating, discussing religion, philosophy, metaphysics, and so on. So yeah, thanks for having me.
Great. In fact, the link to Dry Apologist channel is below in the description. We have no comments yet, which is weird. Anyway, if anybody does have comments or questions, we'd be happy to address all of them toward the end. We'll start out with, why don't you, I've gone over my position so many times, and I will again very quickly, but why don't we start with you talking about your metaphysical position, your justification for it, where you're coming from?
Yeah. Well, I try to ground my metaphysical views in, I guess sometimes called first principles, or they could be called like self-evident principles, which I would view as like laws of logic, at least in some sense. I'm open-minded to the idea that some laws of logic could have counterexamples in some circumstances, but basically like the law of non-contradiction, identity, law of excluded middle, being applied to reality and then deriving entailments from those, and then also sort of inductive knowledge, taking that induction works about the world around us. And then I would also probably say like other conceptual truths like justice and so on that, I would say we can get moral truths from. so I would take those as kind of my starting point, and I just take them as self-evident. I just think that while I can't prove them as being correct or true, that it just seems so obvious to me that they are, and then derive other conclusions from that. And I wouldn't say that most conclusions can be can be arrived at with certainty, but I would say we can have a high enough degree of justification about some claims that I could say that it's justified in believing them. But I would say most arguments probably don't reach that level, but I would say that framework I view as justified for doing metaphysics. So.
Are there any particular schools of philosophy or philosophers that you rely on?
Um, Not really. I mean, I definitely follow the more like analytic tradition, but at the same time, like I'm not like, I mean, I can recognize there are valid criticisms as well. I more just kind of study arguments that I like, but I mean, I guess probably fit into more of the Aristotelian, scholastic way of thinking probably
The
attracts me the most.
scholastics, yeah, which is where most of the theistic arguments come from. Just real quickly, for those who might not know, I follow mostly the German tradition, but it's really a continental tradition that I see as ever since Francis Bacon, um, reducing and reducing the role of metaphysics until we get to the late 19th and the 20th centuries, where metaphysics basically, as I see it, dies. It is just simply an anachronistic sort of relic. With Bacon, and what he did is he started with science, with the scientific method, with empiricism, and removed science from the realm of metaphysics. Until then, metaphysics and science were intricately linked, all the way back to Aristotle, whose metaphysics came out of his physics. And over time, we get to the Enlightenment and people like Hume, who worked toward totally eliminating metaphysics. In his own writings, he did everything he could to remove any metaphysical terminology and replace it with simple English words. You have Kant, who kind of tried to split the difference. He said empiricism is true objectively, and we can know nothing other than, I mean, we have innate reason, but it's only properly used with sense data. If we go beyond the sense data, which is metaphysical speculation, you fall into transcendental illusion, and that's what his antinomies were about. Basically, his point there was that all kinds of unsolvable metaphysical issues become tangled once we take reason beyond the senses. Then you come to Schopenhauer. The one thing that he, like I said, Kant tried to split the difference so that reason he did transcendentally deduce as will, and will as God. So he retained that aspect of rationalism, but said we really can't know too much about that other than through reason. That will gave us reason, so we'll apply reason to sense data, and we'll have some sort of knowledge of at least objectively, we will know the world. We'll never know it noumenally, but that's not the world we live in. You get to Schopenhauer, who inverts will. Will is no longer noumenal. I mean, it's no longer from God. Will comes from the physical urge of existence. It is just the elemental core of the universe. And then Nietzsche takes that further, and then you get to Heidegger and Wittgenstein, who absolutely, their task in their mature work was to always resist the temptation to think metaphysically, and they both put it in similar ways. It's to remain silent before what cannot be spoken. They both talked of mystery in the world, das Mystische, and that's really what's at the basis of things. But most of that we can't understand with our limited cognitive abilities, our adaptations, and it's best not to say anything at all about what we cannot understand, rather than to make up stories about it, which is, in their view, what metaphysics is. Or it gets back to Kant's transcendental illusion. It's making assertions about things beyond sense data. So that's basically where I come from. Any response to that, Caleb?
Yeah, that's basically my understanding of my little bit limited study of Kant and other thinkers that followed him. Yeah, I mean, I disagree with that, but yeah, that's definitely my perspective of what they were arguing.
Right, and that's what I come out of also. Where they differed was on the essence of language. Heidegger thought that we could go further, but not rationally, not through propositional logic, but aesthetically, which was since the Enlightenment, there are two major overarching themes in philosophy. One of them is the reduction or elimination of metaphysics. The other um, is increasing the importance of aesthetic knowledge over rational objective knowledge. And Heidegger thought that through aesthetic knowledge, especially poetry, we could understand things about being that are hidden when we look at it metaphysically. Whereas Wittgenstein said, all we have is the everyday language games, and anything that goes beyond that, we need to remain silent about unless we can show it. One of the things I notice is you do pose metaphysical arguments for God. That's one of your activities.
Yeah.
And I was very interested in you've sort of got your own alteration of the argument from necessity. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to quickly summarize it, or I could read what the argument is, whichever you prefer.
I'll just summarize it because I phrase it in different ways and I've changed it a little since. Yeah, and I mean it is my argument, but I mean it certainly follows, some other people.
Josh, right? It's a lot like Josh Rasmussen's among others.
Yeah, it's kind of it's something I've been tinkering with for a long time, and I like the way he works it some, but I differ from him a little bit. But basically, just to give the rundown, I say there is causality, and if there's causality, it must be grounded in a foundation, and a foundation is either contingent or necessary. And then I argue causality can't be grounded in a contingent foundation, because I argue that would face a bootstrapping problem as to what causes the causality to be grounded. But it can be grounded in a necessary foundation by necessity. Therefore, causality must be grounded in a necessary foundation. And then I argue that anything that's limited in its being or attributes is contingent, which I just take flowing from at least a plausible intuition that the nature of contingency just is limitations. And therefore, if something's a necessary foundation, it's going to be unlimited in its being or attributes. And something that's unlimited in being is going to be unlimited in all aspects of being, which I include as power, presence, intelligence, empathy, and others. But those are enough to get you to the traditional conception of God. I think if the premises are accepted, the conclusion follows that the God of classical monotheism and that just the traditional philosophical sense should be accepted. But of course, the premises are controversial. So,
Right. That's typically the case with these scholastic arguments. Is in most situations, not in all, but in most situations, the formal logic is valid. It's the premises that can become problematic. There are a couple of them that have logical problems, like the ontological argument is logically fallacious, but we need not go into that right now. Could you can, okay. If, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask some questions, beginning with, in your first premise, you say, if there is causality, then there exists a metaphysically necessary foundation that grounds the causality. Can I first ask, what do you mean by metaphysical?
Yeah. Yeah, and I've taken that word out of my newer
Okay.
formulation just to avoid any confusion. But by metaphysical, in that sense, I just meant broadly necessary. So it wouldn't be something that, like, there are no married bachelors, which you can get the necessity just from analyzing the words. I meant like it would be necessity you would arrive at through other implications. So that's all that I meant by metaphysical. But yeah, I took that word out though.
Okay, so what, if I could just clarify, what you don't mean then is there is an otherworldly sort of ideal or law that governs the physical universe, but rather it's just simply a necessity.
Mhm. Yeah, so yeah, I would take metaphysical necessity to be logical necessity, just broad logical necessity. So not like immediately obvious logical necessity, but still
Hmm.
logical necessity.
Okay, how would, in what then, if reason then would then need to be grounded?
It depends. So I do think reason, yeah, it depends upon what you mean by that.
Well, I mean it in however way you're meaning it to say that it implies causality.
Oh, okay, because you said, yeah, I think causality needs to be grounded, but
If
reason.
I understood you right, you grounded it in reason, did you not?
Um, no,
Oh,
no, I
I'm
wouldn't
sorry.
say. Oh, it's fine. I wouldn't say reason like in the sense of like principles of logic and stuff
Hmm.
necessarily need to be grounded. I'm fine with grounding it in God, but I don't require that. I'm not convinced that that's necessarily the case, but I would say causality though needs to be grounded in a necessary foundation. Yeah,
Okay, and just so I can be clear, what do you ground the causality in?
a necessary foundation.
And what's the necessary foundation?
Yeah. Well, at the earliest outset of the argument, necessary foundation just means something concrete that exists and could not have failed to exist. So by concrete, I just mean something that we can interact with. It's not like an idea or a concept.
Okay. And then you move from that to causality does exist. And what do you support that premise on?
Yeah, I would just take that as self-evident. So if somebody said, well, they don't accept that, I mean, we would just be
Hmm.
at an impasse. But for example, like I click my mouse and it makes things happen, and I see that all the time. So it's just, to me, that's just inductively supported. Like what causality is the link which that explains our inductive generalizations is what I would take it to do. Something like that.
And would you say that's elemental to all physical reality?
Yeah, I would say, yeah, it just permeates reality. Now, I'm open to the idea that there could be indeterministic. I'm not necessarily saying every event has a cause, but I'm saying that the events that we would say are regular do have a cause. So it could be that there are uncaused events at the quantum level. I don't know, but I'm just saying, like, if I see a bat hits a ball, that's a cause. The bat caused the ball to move. Is how I would approach it.
Yeah, how would you know, obviously this brings up Hume, who said that we infer causality, but we don't know causality. When the one billiard ball hits the other, we don't see the cause. We just see one thing, then another thing. And if these things happen often enough, you know, these are images we have. And if these images are connected often enough, we habitually infer causality, but we don't know causality.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's fair. And I know there's debate over how to interpret Hume, and I wouldn't be able to weigh on it on that too much. But yeah, I would say it is an inference, but I would take it as a justified inference. You know, we see, I think we just observe causal connections all the time, and it's reasonable to infer there is causality. And by that, I just take it, there are, of course, different interpretations, but I kind of like the interpretation that concrete things just have a dispositional power, you know, like matter just has the power to attract other pieces of matter, something like that. And I just take that as just a reasonable inference about reality.
Yeah, it's an inference. It's not, well, Kant wrote in reaction to Hume's skepticism, and he justified it by saying that it's one of the categories of understanding. It's a priori, it derives from reason, and reason ultimately comes from God. So, you know, we have the rationalist input there also, but he had to revert to rationalism in order to justify causality. The problem I see with it, though, is when we get to contemporary physics, the whole notion of causality becomes extremely questionable. The I mean, it's a quantum world. We're quantum beings within a quantum world, and we've adapted to it. But in reality, the causality it's not a mechanistic universe. And without a mechanistic universe, causality seems to go out the window. At the very most elemental layer of existence, it's quantum fields, and there is no predictable causality. It's indeterminate. The best we can do is come up with probabilities, kind of, but it's indeterminate. Causality, mechanistic causality, does not exist at the elemental level of the universe. One way of interpreting things is that our reason, our ability to objectify the world and infer things it was an adaptation that didn't tell us anything really about reality. It was a practical shorthand or icon sort of view of things so that we could manipulate objects within a very narrow range of reality. You know, the existence that we live in, or something, the Newtonian realm of existence, so that we can make predictions and plans, and it helped us to survive. That's how we escaped our predators and caught our prey. But it didn't tell us anything real about the world. As Hoffman says, Donald Hoffman, he says, you know, what we see is like the icons on the graphic interface of the computer. The reality is this unintelligible stream of ones and zeros, and we can't make sense of that. So icons appear, you know, that aren't real, but it helps us make some sense of all these eyes, you know, the ones and zeros coming through. So that causality has no reality in fundamental existence. It's basically quantum foam, and we interpret things like causality or time through just simply from perspective, but it's our judgment. It's not a reality. So that's one of the problems I have in accepting premises for the scholastic arguments. It seems to me they're based on a primitive and obsolete physics, and that we need not necessarily accept those premises. Causality isn't necessarily a given. It could be just something we impute to our surroundings, um, and reason could be an error, and that it was a useful adaptation, but it doesn't tell us the real nature of existence.
Yeah, I guess the way I would respond to that is even like the imputation, like say our minds are organizing reality. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I would look at that though as a kind of causality. So we may not know the actual nature of like the way like things may be in appearance and so on, and we can't get to like what things really are or something like that. And at the
Right.
quantum level, things are indeterministic, and um, but it does seem though that at some level of reality, at least from my perspective, it seems like there is some sort of regularity of at least our mind's interpretation. Like, I see my computer turn on and we have this
Mm-hmm.
conversation and so on. And I guess, well, that's I would take that just to be causality, and somebody could reject that inference, but it would be pretty hard for me to give that up. It seems about as obvious as anything can be. Now, if you took a total agnostic, like you're just not going to commit anything, you could still reject it. But what do you think about that?
Well, the way I would respond is it seems obvious to us that there's causality in our narrow slice of reality. I mean, just think of the electromagnetic spectrum. It's hugely wide, and we can see in a tiny little narrow band of that spectrum. And it's that way with the rest of reality also. Um, and one of the things physics seems to be teaching us is that there are small quantum systems. And in those systems, regularity can temporarily arise. But that's only from the perspective within that system. As soon as you leave that system, it isn't that regularity doesn't exist. Carlo Rovelli, who is like one of the most brilliant physicists, he's a pioneer in loop quantum gravity, makes a point. He deals with time quite a bit, and he has a saying: "Time is ignorance," because the only way we can have a sense of time is if we focus on a microscopically small um, quantum system in the universe and ignore the 99.99999% of the rest of the universe. Because if we look at that, we can see that it's just an eddy in the river, and it's temporary. But in reality, that system, the regularity within that system is basically, even in itself, um, just a fluctuation, and will go away. So we just happen to be living temporarily in this eddy, which is going to be gone in the blink of an eye cosmically. And we go back to the quantum foam. But time seems so obvious to us, except it doesn't. I mean, there is no universal time. There's no such thing. The same thing with space. It's only a matter of relations in a very small system. Think of it this way, and I think I used this on the last video also. But our conception of time is bound up with entropy. And entropy is really just returning to the chaos of the universe. Um, Now, entropy is going from a low measure of disorder to higher measures of disorder, or going from order to disorder. But that order itself is dependent on perspective. Take a brand new deck of playing cards, and it looks ordered because it's arranged by suit and numerically within suit. So if we look at it from that perspective, the entropy is very low. But if we look at it from the perspective of red and black, it's the entropy is a little higher now. If we look at it from the perspective of all twos, all threes, all fours, up through all aces, the order is completely random. At this point, the entropy is high. So it's a matter of perspective. We in our perspective create the illusions of orders in time and space, and we participate in it. But fundamentally, it's all quantum foam with no time, with no order, with no causality. It only appears that way. Do you know who Eugene Wigner was?
I mean, I've heard the name, but I wouldn't be able to tell you about it.
Won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1963. He was a mathematical physicist and also a brilliant philosopher. And he came up with something he called the epistemological law of empiricism. And he showed, and he borrowed from Poincaré's earlier essay on the four geometries, which showed that you can have rational systems with completely contradictory premises that are all internally consistent. And Wigner pointed out not only that, but you can take the same premises in the same thing and have different explanations, even totally different rational systems explaining the exact same phenomena. But what he showed is that any time that we understand something, we understand it in a tight boundary of time, space, and chosen events. For example, Newtonian physics is within a very tight boundary of time, space, and chosen events. If we go to relativity, we've expanded those boundaries, and that understanding dissipates. It gets pulled beyond its senses, and now we need another explanation. So we come up with relativity. Now, if we go down to the quantum level, once again, we've slipped the bounds, the tight bounds of time, space, and chosen events, and now neither Newtonian physics nor Einstein's relativity can explain it. So we have another tightly bound rational system bound by chosen events, time, and space, and they all contradict each other. And you can't put them together because that's his epistemical law of empiricism, is any rational system that you develop is dependent on whatever events presented themselves to you within tightly bounded time and space, which means there is no overall explanation of the universe, at least none that we can know through our limited cognition, but it probably is just simply random cosmic foam. So that what we're arguing about, or not arguing about, but what we're discussing here in the argument could be seen as the metaphysical illusions that come from a primitive physics. And we know that, even though we don't understand the universe, we understand our prior misunderstanding of the universe, which is how I would respond to what you just said, why I wouldn't accept the premises, because physical reality seems to deny those premises. What I'm saying is, it seems within our limited epistemological realm to be self-evident, but all these things that appear self-evident, when you go beyond the Newtonian realm, aren't self-evident at all anymore.
What would you think about the application only having sort of a limited range? So maybe at some level, um, these principles don't apply, let's say, but at some level they do. Let's
Hmm.
just say, like at our mental
Well,
level, would
yeah,
you?
that's the
Yeah.
emergent. There is a school of thought that things emerge, and what we see as time, space, and causality are objectively real and emergent off of lower levels of reality. I think that's a metaphysical leap that I'm not willing to make. But let's tie it back to the proof of God, because what we're really talking about is first cause of the universe, right?
Well, not necessarily. So the argument, at least traditionally, and I would be fine with granting, is like say the universe could be past eternal, or began uncaused. It's more about
Hmm.
what's grounding everything right here and now.
Right.
So, yeah, so I would say it's more about a contemporary kind of grounding.
Well, if because if that's the case, if we're looking for the ground of things, which is a good thing to look for, that was Heidegger's whole enterprise, was to look for the ground, which he saw in being. Um, the more we look at being, the less deterministic it is. And my approach would be, let's forget all the metaphysical stuff. Just get it out of our minds and look at what there is. And that's being. Um, we can't deny being because we are a part of it. We're surrounded by it. We're quantumly entangled in it. That's the one thing we know is being. The question is, what is it, and what is its essence? That is the question. Now, if we were to resist metaphysics, we would be quiet where we can't say anything, but we can say some things. Um, is there a ground? I would say that being is the ground of everything. I would say that. But I would deny, or I would not take the step of saying being is anything other than the physical universe or other universes. I have no idea. All I know is this universe, and I don't even know this universe. All I know is my little part within this little world within the universe. But I can't deny being. Let me go back to Heidegger. In his essay on the question of technology, he he points to the beginning of the metaphysical era when the Greeks went from a, and is not a copula here. It is the most active of verbs. A means a as it is in its essence and how it is, to a equals a. Because when we went to a equals a, the move there is to obliterate being. Is being. Being just simply is it. It's the ontology. It is what is. Being is. And we have obliterated the is and made things in this world into second order objects. And we've displaced being to some imaginary metaphysical realm. Now, if we were to reverse that move, bring being back to where to the real meaning of the world, being is things that exist right here, they are, is, um, and resist the temptation to metaphysical thinking, we might understand the grounds of things better, but we would understand them differently. We wouldn't understand them as logical propositions. We wouldn't understand them as rational systems. We would understand it as it presents itself to us without trying to change it. So, how would we know morality? Well, we look into our essence, and we come from being. What is the essence of being, and what is it telling us about morality? Well, it won't tell us anything about laws because there are no laws, but it will tell us things we can feel. And if you think about it, morality is not a law, it's a gut reaction. You see somebody torturing a baby, you're not going to reason your way to that's a bad thing. You're going to feel it viscerally. It's innate. It's something that it's an aesthetic. Um, so why would we need, if we want to ground things in being, which I think we do, I think we agree on that, why would I want to remove being outside of existence?
Um, so what do you mean by remove being outside of existence?
Metaphysical, it becomes a metaphysical construct. A, when we go from A is A, where A is, it is the being itself, to A equals A. Now A isn't A. A is just this concept equal to other A's. The being is in the Platonic realm or in God or some other metaphysical ideal that determines the being, but that essence lies outside of our physical world. That's what I mean.
So when you say A is A, or I guess I don't know that I disagree with your position, but I guess where we would disagree is arriving at something beyond the empirical. Is that where we would
Beyond,
differ?
I wouldn't use the word empirical. I
Okay.
would say the sensible, and that's the word that both Heidegger and Wittgenstein use. Sinn. It's the senses, sense data. When I talked about earlier Wittgenstein's use of the word sinnlos, it means senseless. We translate it as nonsense, but it has the same mean. And sinnlos can also mean nonsense in German. And what he's saying is metaphysics is nonsense because it is imagining things beyond the sensible. Empirical to me has the scientific connotation of objective knowledge, um, which suffers from what Heidegger saw as the move from A is A to A equals A. Heidegger sees all of technology, and this is from the question of technology. He sees all of technology as metaphysical understanding in order to manipulate the environment. Wittgenstein came to a similar conclusion, which is why he rejected propositional logic in systematic philosophy. If you look at philosophical inquiries, um, it's just a hodgepodge of, I mean, there's some overall organization to it, but really it's a hodgepodge of aphorisms because, as I said at the beginning, what we're going to do is look at what's there. So he's going from here to here to here, looking at what's there, trying to untangle the knots that we got from metaphysical language, kind of like, sort of like what we're doing here. But that's what I mean by, as soon as we say A equals A, we've obliterated being in this physical world because this physical world simply becomes objects, equatable objects, and their essence is determined elsewhere outside of the world. And as I said, that could be Platonic idealism, it could be Christian rationalism, but being does not exist in our sensible world. And that is the issue. In my view, that is the issue of metaphysics and the problem it creates.
Okay. So when you say A is A, what is A standing for in that statement? Is it being, or you don't have a
No.
determinant? Okay.
A is anything we encounter in the world.
Okay.
Anything that we encounter in the world, we can know authentically by trying to understand its essence. And anything we encounter in the world is a part of being. We all share in being. That's the one thing we all have. We are, and our essences, non-metaphysically, would all be here within the physical world, and there is being because it's all here, and being is the ground of everything. It in my opinion, would have essence. Being has essence. We're beings. We have essence, and our essence is an offshoot of all the universal being. Which leads us to another question: is there an intent? And I would, oddly for an atheist, I would say yes. There's intent in the universe. We can see it. We can see an arc, and perhaps one of the intentions of being is to someday experience itself. And there we have animal life that adapts and evolves to the point where we have poetic knowledge of itself. We can aesthetically experience ourselves. Being aesthetically experiences itself through us when we let being speak through us. We aesthetic means to sort of vibrate with reality as it is without distorting it, without reducing it. It's reductionism that gets us to metaphysics in the end.
So when you say we are beings, but then we share in being, and like, and sounds like you're ascribing some existence to something that's beyond us, but I don't know if you're meaning that more metaphorically or literally.
I mean it literally.
Okay, because
to the extent we can talk literally, because everything comes down to metaphor, but that's a whole other discussion. But what I mean is there is being, and it infuses, it is the universe, and it has an essence. And the essence is the mystery that draws us as thinkers. It draws the best physicists, because it's the mystery of being that draws us. We want to know, which is being trying to know itself, to experience itself. And we're a part of that. But our understanding is limited at this point. I mean, the real essence it appears to be random quantum foam, but with an intent. I mean, another way of looking at it is to look at genetics. We can reductively say DNA is a code. It's not a code. It's something that we can't fathom, but it has intent. There's intent in DNA. It's to propagate itself, but also propagate itself toward. And that's where we look at our adaptive morality and how it's changed over 3,000 years of written history. Toward. It goes toward openness. It goes toward acceptance. It goes toward peace and away from brutality. It goes toward love, toward it. Now, that doesn't mean we're there. We're far from it. But we've moved in that direction perceptively over the last 3,000 years. Does DNA play a part in it? Yeah, I think it does. That's where our essence comes from. Scientifically, we can look at it as genetic code, but that's the objective reductionist view of it. It's being.
So when you say like being, which is the universe, and your view, and it has this intent, like that sounds compatible with like this sort of contingency necessity argument. But then I would go a little further and ascribe attributes, like personal attributes, to this ground of being. But where would you say, like, where would your reasoning differ on that, other than ascribing, personal attributes?
Because that would be a reduction. That's speaking where we can't speak. we can, it's a little bit, tiny bit of being has been revealed to us. Nowhere near enough that we can say this is the essence of being. These are its characteristics. It probably can't even be understood in those metaphysical terms. So I would say that's where I would need to remain silent.
Would you say that being is infinite or unlimited, or would you say we can't know that?
That's a question I think about a lot, and I don't know the answer to it. It very well, I mean, I am certain that it far exceeds our capacity to grasp. But if it's infinite, then it can be anything and everything, and I'm not sure that's the case. I think there is a definite, here's what I think is, there is a definite essence to being. To try to categorize it or even put it in terms of is it finite or infinite is to reduce it to metaphysical, mathematical assertions that don't apply. That's our objective knowledge, that practical knowledge that reduces to icons, but it doesn't apply to reality. So my response would be that we can't understand it in those terms. The very, just like Kant in the first antinomy talked about is, does the universe have a beginning or was it eternal? They're nonsense characteristics because they're, first of all, it's beyond our ability to ever get sense data. But second, it's applying temporal categories to non-temporal existence. So I think that's what we're doing here. We're applying categories that are familiar to us, and it seems like the world divides into those. But if we go back to Wigner's ELE, it doesn't. We can't. It's a nonsensical. It's a nonsensical proposition. Sinnlos in Wittgenstein's term.
So would you say a word like, because I look at a word like finite, at least in the way I'm using it, to mean like I'm using equivalent to like limited or restricted. Would you give the same answer if I use those words, or okay?
Yeah.
I just want to make sure because sometimes people have different interpretations. So I'm curious, like I know you like, and I haven't studied these people enough to give any thoughts or just ask questions, but like Wittgenstein, I know had like a religious sort of belief. But where would you differ with him on his beliefs? Because my understanding is
Interesting
he's kind of
question.
fideistic, but I don't know.
He didn't believe in any gods, and he wasn't. Well, he wasn't pantheistic like Spinoza or like Einstein, but he to say there was something like a God would be to speak where he should remain silent. Das Mystische, the mystic, was the ultimate reality to him. And that brings up questions that heretofore were within the realm of theology, but are best probably addressed outside of theology. And that was Heidegger's mission also. I studied with a French Christian philosopher, Paul Ricoeur, who told me on several occasions that in Europe, theologians, I don't really know if they have any equivalent of apologists in Europe, but theologians and philosophers of Christian belief were very interested in Heidegger and Nietzsche because they asked the same questions theologians ask. but look for the answer in physical being rather than a metaphysical God. But we're asking the same questions. We're just looking in different places for the answers. And I would say that applies to Wittgenstein also. He was not a religious man. He did not believe in a God, but he was interested in those same questions. And the answer is found in the mystical or the mysterious. It can be, yeah, das Mystische can mean mystical, it can mean the mysterious. We've sort of separated those meanings. In German, they ride together.
So, do you think that anything can be said about being? Because I know it sounds like you don't want to ascribe attributes, but would you
Mm-hmm.
say like the law of non-contradiction, does that apply to being?
No, absolutely not. That is part of the reductionist. We know the law of contradiction does not exist outside of our that's the slender Newtonian band of reality that our understanding adapted within. You go beyond that, the law of contradiction goes away. Look at superposition. That is the contradiction of the law of contradiction, superposition. It is and it isn't at the same time.
Now, my understanding that's pretty limited, but is that like where a particle is in two places at once? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, it's in two states at once, but is all those states at the same time. It is everything it can be at the same, all the possibilities at the same time until a wave collapse occurs. And of course, that gets us into metaphysical speculation that people like Sean Carroll like to travel down, but I won't go. But at the bottom, in the quantum level, we violate the principle of non-contradiction. We also do in the level of, in the macro level of relativity, where all sorts of totally illogical things necessarily happen. So reason does not, the universe is not rational. And the law of contradiction is the central principle of rationality. Rationality is a practical adaptation that was extremely helpful in our surviving on the savannah and propelled us to technological progress, but it isn't real. Remember, I talked about those eddies in the stream, or Wigner's ELE. Small systems can maintain some sort of apparent order for a period of time. And that is much to do with our imputation of reason, or our forcing of reason on a small subset of reality. And as soon as we expand that, the world, reason doesn't explain anything.
So, in working with that, would you say it's possible then, or I mean, maybe you're going to say you just aren't going to apply speech, but like for being to be and not be at the same time, would that be possible, or that's just something you're not going to speculate on?
Yeah, that sounds to me like what Wittgenstein would call putting flies in the bottles, and then we just have to take the fly back out. It's to exist, and what that is we're looking at it logically, trying to apply the law of non-contradiction to where it doesn't belong.
So then extending that, would you say it's possible that you exist and don't exist, or is that, again, I'm doing the same thing?
Again, to me, it sounds like a sinnlos Frage, a senseless question.
Okay.
The kind of thing that only metaphysics could drive you to. That's when Wittgenstein talks about getting the fly out of the bottle or untangling the elusive nature of philosophical language, that's exactly the sort of thing that he's getting at. Is it gets us into nonsensical questions that seem like a dilemma, but actually if you untangle it, you see it really didn't refer to anything real.
And then would you say under this system, is there a kind of defeater for your epistemology in principle? Like, would there be something that would cause you to adopt a new kind of framework for viewing these questions, or is this
Oh,
just like
sure.
both starting? Okay.
If in fact we came up, I mean, there are physicists who still adamantly believe in a rational universe that can be understood through one equation. I don't believe that's ever going to happen, and I think Wigner showed exactly why. But if it did happen, if they came up with the grand theory of everything, the grand unification theory, that would make me rethink my position. But I don't believe that there's any chance that's ever going to happen.
What would that look like, though? So if they came up with a grand like, how would you know that that actually works? Because they like test it, or
Well, because yes, it would be testable. It would it would be one mathematical equation because the assumption is that mathematics is wholly applicable to the universe, which by all appearances, it's not. But it would be a mathematical simple equation that would answer all of the questions of relativity, Newtonian physics, and quantum physics, which nothing can do right now because they have totally contradictory results and premises. Um, but it would be you have an equation and it would give you the right answer at the macro level, the right answer at the Newtonian level, and the right answer at the quantum level instead of having to use, for they use totally, you couldn't have the same equation because they use completely different mathematics. Newton had to develop calculus for Newtonian physics. Einstein thought he had to invent a new geometry until a friend of his pointed out that Riemann already had. But Riemannian geometry works pretty well to explain relativity, but it doesn't. It has opposite premises from Newtonian physics or Euclidean geometry. So you can't apply it there, and it doesn't apply to the quantum level either. And so Hilbert space had to be utilized and different types of algebra. Now, it's three entirely different contradictory worlds. If you could unify those into because they're three contradictory worlds, I take that as evidence that the universe in itself is not rational. It's not understandable through reason. We can only understand it aesthetically. But if someone's did succeed in coming up with this, like they talk about an equation you could put on your T-shirt that answers all those questions, I would certainly have to reconsider my position and say maybe the universe really is rational. But I don't see that happening.
so how would you know at that point if there was an equation that that's not your mind like imposing that order? You wouldn't, or
I still wouldn't know for sure, right? I still wouldn't know for sure, and we're stuck in that situation so often. Um, we talk about people talk about is consciousness. They talk about panpsychism. Is consciousness embedded in all physical reality? Which gets us to the question of is consciousness required to collapse the wave, it's for wave collapse. And we can't possibly know, because any measurement we take of a wave collapse, we are entangled with the measuring device. So consciousness is already involved. We have no way of looking at an example of wave collapse where consciousness isn't involved. It certainly could happen all the time, but we can't tell from our perspective. It's impossible to do. The same thing with anything definitive on time and space. It looks like it doesn't exist. John Bell proved non-locality in the 60s, but on the other hand, we can't conceive of anything outside of time and space. We can't even come up with language that doesn't 100% rely on temporal spatial terminology. And we can't get out. So we can't get out of our perceptions in time and space to actually observe, is time and space really elemental to the universe, or just something we impose on it? Again, we'll never know. We can't know. All we can know is we can't think without it. There's no way you can talk about the timelessness or the non-locality of the physical world without using temporal spatial terminology, because we're just not capable of doing that, which means we can't even imagine what it is, and it puts it in the metaphysical realm, and that's where I stop chasing it and remain silent.
Now, I'm wondering how you would differentiate between these two then, because if there was like this grand unification theory, you're saying like it could be something derived from your mind, you wouldn't know. But then it seems it could be that your mind is the one that you're getting the confusion or like the irreconcilability right now. So how would you, but you're saying if you found the theory, like grand theory, that would be evidence that reality is rational. But I guess it seems though, I'm just wondering if you take this position or not, that you start with the way that we interpret reality is evidence for the way reality is. Would you say that's like an assumption that you have, or?
I would say that we have two modes of understanding. We have our objective, rational, technological mode, and I think it's fairly evident that that's something that we more impose on the world from our perspective, all the way down to time at the quantum level. And then we have aesthetic knowledge, which we don't. The difference is the technological or metaphysical understanding is reductionist and therefore false. Aesthetic understanding is non-reductionist. It's more unmediated and truer, but that gets us into the language problem where Wittgenstein says show instead of tell. I give this example too much, but I'm going to give it again. Have you read Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov?
Parts of it.
Okay. The ending is the sort of thing that shakes you up for the rest of your life. It scars your soul and you'll never get over it. If you have any kind of aesthetic sensitivity at all. But what it gives you is an unmediated connection to the essence of morality, and you'll never forget it. But it's non-reductionist. You could write books and books and books about it and not exhaust it. You certainly couldn't reduce it in any meaningful way to laws or systems. It's an overwhelming aesthetic experience that transcends all of that. And that's where I follow the Heideggerian project of poetic knowledge, because that's exactly what Dostoevsky does in that example. He gives us overwhelming poetic knowledge of the revelation of morality, and it's something that will affect you the rest of your life, and you will have a grasp of what morality entails and what the intention is and what the direction is. Um, and so I think it's knowable in that sense.
Sorry to clarify, you think it in the aesthetic sense? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, aesthetic knowledge gives us non-reduced, unmediated connection to being. That's the whole point of authentic poetry, authentic art, authentic music. In any symphony of Beethoven will give you far more profound knowledge than both volumes of Einstein's theory of relativity, because it's unmediated. It's not reductive. It's not so easy to put into words. You'd be silly to try to put Beethoven's Sixth Symphony into words. In reading the score, and you can read the score, I can read the score, but it's not the same thing. You have to experience it, because then it becomes unmediated, and there's a profound wisdom in it. There's a profound presentation of the being of the universe in those symphonies.
Yeah.
That's aesthetic knowledge, and that's what we need to cultivate, which we have forgotten, for centuries. Bernardo Kastrup has got an interesting way of putting that. Called it we are in the idolatry of the nerds, and the nerds are psychic cripples who see everything objectively, see everything technologically, and have no aesthetic sense at all. But those are the idols of today. That's a thing to overcome.
Yeah. It's interesting.
So where you look for God, I just look into what can the mystery in this physical universe, which is unfathomable, what can it show me? And it won't show me anything I can put into a theory. It won't give me anything I could put into a systematic philosophy. We've shown that those things are invalid. Or at least we've learned that those things are invalid. But what can it show me? Can it show me the same thing it showed Dostoevsky when he gave us unmediated experience of morality at the end of the Brothers Karamazov? That's the quest. And it's the same question as you asked. I'm just looking in a different place.
Yeah, it's interesting. You probably don't have a lot or any other rabbit holes to go on your position right now.
Okay.
To think about it.
Yeah, we've gone an hour and 15 minutes already. I don't know if you have anything more you would like to cover, or if this is a good breaking point. For some reason, we have no questions. I hope we're actually broadcasting.
Yeah.
It's never happened that we've had no questions. I think you're all going, what the hell are these guys talking about? But do you have anything else, Kelly? Anything more? Any more questions, or anything you'd like to say from your side? Because I've kind of hogged the conversation, which I hate to do, but I naturally fall into. Anything more?
Okay, it looks like we are live, so that's good. I just checked your site. But no, I think that's probably a good stopping point. I think that we covered both our views well. I'd be curious, we don't have commenters right now, but what others think. But yeah, I think that's probably a good stopping point.
I very much am thankful that you joined us today. I'm trying to get people like you and like Craig and like Kyle and like Ron and like John Buck to come on here and have these discussions. I mean, I've done a lot of videos where I critique people like William Lane Craig, for whom I have no respect at all, or some other apologists in that mold. But I think these are far more worthwhile, where we can actually do as Wittgenstein said, let's look at what's present before us and have a dialogue, because you usually find out there's a whole lot more in common than there is in opposition. So thank you for coming. I hope you, I hope at some point you return.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, I enjoyed it.
Great. Talk to you later. And good
All
night,
right.
everybody.
Thanks. I'll see you.